You are listening to ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.
Hello, this is Merel Spierings, researcher at the Environmental, Social and Governance Center here at the Conference Board. The ESG Center focuses on helping companies define and fulfill their evolving role in society by providing timely and relevant insights for what's ahead in the areas of corporate governance, sustainability and citizenship. Today we're going to talk about a topic that is, or at least in light of recent developments should be, on top of mind for executives and corporate board members around the globe: ESG disclosure. The ESG reporting landscape is quickly evolving. Not only is it cluttered with reporting frameworks and standards, new disclosure regulations are arising in many jurisdictions. For example, here in the US, companies are facing the SEC's proposed ESG disclosure rules on topics such as cybersecurity and climate change, and emerging ESG requirements in the European Union will have implications not just for EU-based companies, but for those beyond as well. If anything, this confirms that ESG disclosure is a reality and not a trend that will fade and go away. I'm delighted to be joined today by Andrew Fowler, partner at the law firm of Hughes Hubbard Reed, who will share his insights on how companies can prepare for upcoming disclosure requirements, specifically the SEC's proposed rules on climate. Andrew is active in the firm's aviation, corporate finance, and securities and capital markets groups. He also represents issuers and financial institutions on general corporate governance and SEC reporting issues. And last but not least, Andrew is co-author of an incredible free resource that Hughes Hubbard Reed recently put out. It's called How to ESG, a resource guide for establishing an ESG program for your company. The guide provides practical guidance in addressing emerging ESG norms and requirements. It also recommends topics that a company's ESG program should cover, such as climate change, diversity, equity, and inclusion, supply chain, and forced labor. It also outlines considerations for complying with government investigations. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you so much for having me, and the firm and I are very grateful for this opportunity, and hope that we can give people and company leadership guidance on how they can address these emerging challenges and opportunities around ESG.
Great, and I'm sure you can. So before we dive into the wondrous world of ESG disclosure, I was hoping you can talk a little bit about the resource guide that I just mentioned. So what is it about? Why did your firm put it together? Who are the primary audiences? And basically, how can it be used?
Sure. So the way that we had envisioned this guide, we a few years ago, actually, this goes back, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, and even further, we'd seen ESG emerging more and more as a critical area where company leadership really needed, I think, to be able to look a little bit ahead down the road. And that's one of the things that I think the guide is good for. It doesn't attempt to cover every single detail, because obviously this is a very, very broad topic, but what it does do is it gives an overview of the most critical areas that most companies would face, in terms of the most obvious being, of course, climate and carbon emissions, and then things like, as you're noting, there's tie-ins to anti-corruption, there's tie-ins to labor issues, diversity and inclusion. And the way that we think that company leadership and the audience really is, it's anyone in the industry or in those who counsel the industry, various industries. It's designed to allow those folks to get an idea of these are the areas that might be impacting their company, to be thinking about it, to really start the conversation. And hopefully many of them have started the conversation, but to either start or focus their conversation about where they need to examine policies, procedures, personnel. And it really is designed as we thought about it, as a toolkit or a roadmap to face these issues, figure out where the opportunities are, where there are some risks for many companies in making sure that they address these issues head on. But our idea was that this wasn't, it's not a 1,000-page book. It's, I think just under 200 pages in its latest iteration, but it has it has key focus areas and key topics, and even just looking down the table of contents, it hits we believe the main areas that companies initially need to focus. So it is, we originally were thinking of even putting on the cover of it a picture of a toolkit with with a leaf on it or something, as funny as that may sound, because the idea was to get people focused on, this is a place you can go to get, whether you're a compliance officer or you're a C-suite executive and you feel like you need to quickly get a hand on some of these issues. We designed it as a touchstone and a place where people could go, and then they could use that if they wish to use it as a starting point and then go from there, or to the extent that they need guidance about particular areas. And we also wanted to, you mentioned the European rules, and we'll get into this a little later, but the European regulatory regime in this area has been out ahead of the US regime. And there are some areas where, particularly for multinationals, it's necessary for them to focus both on the developing ESG environment in the United States and the SEC regulatory regime, but also how these rules impact the operations across a number of jurisdictions. And in many cases, a more comprehensive approach, or at least a comprehensive lens to analyze these issues, we think is very helpful for companies that have broader operations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I fully agree. It really reads as a toolkit. And just to confirm that it's not only for public companies, it's also for lenders and borrowers, it's for funds and advisors. So it really, it's, as you mentioned, it's for anybody in the industry, and it truly holds a wealth of information. So I strongly recommend everybody to get a free copy today. So let's talk about the main topic, about ESG disclosure. The guide discusses various frameworks for ESG disclosure, TCFD, SASB, GRI, just to name a few. It also talks about, as you mentioned, regulations and foreseeable developments, both in the US and Europe, and in our other jurisdictions, of course. And it offers guidance on public company financial disclosures. So there's a lot there, and we could talk about this all day long. But just in the interest of time, let's focus on the SEC's proposed climate disclosure rule. It has been a few months since it came out. So can you please provide a quick overview of that rule before we delve into the rest of our discussion? Specifically, what are the key elements of the rule? When will it be finalized, or when do you think it may become effective? And are there any likely changes between the proposed and the final rule?
Sure, and there have been some developments and changes, some not unexpected, and some maybe are, some folks may have thought this would move more quickly or more slowly, depending on various political and regulatory pressures. So first, to give, and this is very high level, because there's, number one, things may change. Number two, there's as with everything to do with the SEC and generally, technical financial regulatory matters for disclosures, there's a lot of finer points and rules. But the main thing I think that to start with is that there's going to be a phase-in of required disclosures, particularly around levels of carbon emissions and impacts. And there's, a lot of specificity in the proposed rule, different levels depending on, how close these, pretty much how material and how close these carbon emissions are to the company. But there are some notable areas which we can get into as we go. And one of the ones I mentioned is, because it's sometimes a surprise for people, is there was a proposal that even carbon emissions and climate impacts and other material developments that in the supply chain, even outside of company affiliates and companies that were controlled by a reporting company, there was a proposal, and still is in the rules, to require that companies make what I would call a very strong good faith and procedurally robust effort to figure out if entities and companies and processes, broadly framed, that were integral to the company's business model, suppliers, JV partners, other folks who in the traditional world of disclosure would be kind of considered outside of the reporting company's sphere. So it would be sort of like, well, that's not, it wouldn't be, in the old model, it would be sort of like, well, that's not us, that's something else. So we disclose how our business, in our business dealings, how we deal with the supplier, but we don't really need to get into their impact on the environment or other issues. That would be changed by these proposed rules. And there's also a lot of interplay, of course, between the financial reporting and the notes in particular to audited financial statements and the company's MD&A, which will get into great detail under the proposed rules, would get into great detail on the impacts of, again, carbon emissions, environmental and waste issues, and of course, equally important things like forced labor or dealing with corrupt entities and other issues that, as a policy matter, many, and this is where we get into, investors and lenders and others, many investors and lenders increasingly will be looking to these disclosures, and the purpose of them, one of their main purposes, I believe, is to allow investors and lenders and other market players to really have the information they require to pick more clearly if their investment objective is to not be involved in or to try to minimize their exposure to climate issues or to socially irresponsible or destructive companies. The idea, I think, is that there would be a lot of information that could be put out there for these investors and lenders to choose with really open eyes. And then, so that's sort of the larger picture. In terms of timing, I think when the rules were first proposed, the original optimistic plan was that there would be a comment period, which has been ongoing, and there's been a tremendous amount of comments, as one could imagine, from the gamut of issuers, financial folks in the financial world, activist investors, and that process is ongoing. But there have been some other pressures and issues, and one of the things that happened, and I guess before I get into the specifics, the general trend is that these rules are likely to be delayed to some degree. We're not quite sure, can't really predict how long, but the original plan was, I think, to try to get the rules finalized by probably, or at least start to be finalized probably around now, and that's clearly not happening. So I think the original proposal had in it that they were hoping to get the rules completed by, around mid-October, beginning mid-October. Mm-hmm. Clearly that hasn't happened. And there's a new deadline, I think, for public comments. It was expanded, I believe, to early November, and it may have been expanded again, but I think the latest was to early November, if I recall correctly. So there's still a lot of public debate. None of that is unexpected, but what that's going to do is probably push out the finalization of a rule and the reconciliation of the comments. If I had to guess, it's going to be well into the first half of next year. Mm-hmm. It could be faster, I'm not sure. The other factor, which is critical, is that there was a successful challenge mounted at the Supreme Court level in June of this year. The state of West Virginia, or elements connected with West Virginia, raised a challenge to sort of the whole idea of administrative law being able to impose significant burdens on industry through rulemaking, as opposed to through act of the legislature at the federal level. So this has been a debate that's been going on a long time. A lot of people who are opposed or believe that the rapid growth and the huge aggregation and number of administrative legal rules and requirements is sort of anti-constitutional. There's been a lot of constitutional law debate about this, for decades, and against the backdrop of the SEC trying to finalize these very, very new and rigorous and frankly, for some companies, they're viewed as very burdensome rules. Against that backdrop of the political challenges and the legal challenges that were recently mounted, I think it all comes together that this is not, this is, if someone said, well, when is it going to be adopted? Probably next year, in some form. I would say there may be some adjustments to trim it back here and there, but it's hard to predict exactly what will be
Yeah.
trimmed out of it. And we can talk. I know we've had some in our preliminary discussions. We had some talk about sort of the dangers of trying to predict what's going to be in and out.
Absolutely.
That's critical too.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of uncertainty regarding timing. And just to summarize a little bit about the key elements that you mentioned. So basically, the proposed rule can be described into or can fall into three broad categories. You have the new climate-related disclosure section on annual reports on Form 10K and 20F under Regulation SK. And those will include matters such as climate-related risks and climate-related strategy and disclosure of target and goals, etc. And then you talked a little bit about the emissions itself. So greenhouse gas emissions disclosure and attestation report under Regulation SK. And then what you mentioned as well, the new climate-related disclosures in the notes to the audited financial statements under Regulation SX. So there's definitely a lot there, and it's not an easy lift for companies to prepare. But could you please talk a little bit about how companies in general can or should be preparing for these requirements? What should management and boards be thinking about now, even before the rules are finalized and even before we know exactly what the timing will be? Is there anything that companies can do?
Yes, and I think that's probably one of the most important, not the most important thing that company leadership can be doing right now, because particularly since we're not exactly sure, even though we're not exactly sure what the full scope of the rules will be, it's important that leadership be prepared. So the areas that we think really are most important to focus on are seeing what, well, first of all, before we even get to resources, which are critical, first off, company leadership should look at what are the real impacts, and they should take an honest assessment of, are they a company that, I mean, there are obviously industries that really are at the cutting edge of this. I mean, the energy industries, the extractive industries, some of the industries that are involved in environmentally impacting or impacted activities. Yep. These are very clear. There's also companies where, as part of their business model, they're in a supply chain or in an industry where critical pieces of the components of what they put together as their business or the services they provide are impacted. So the first thing is taking an honest assessment of if these rules go into effect, and outside of the rules, just generally, what is material to our business? Because of course it's important to take a step back and say, well, these rules exist, but whether or not these rules or these proposed rules exist, but whether or not the proposed rules are enacted in full or in part, and regardless of the timing, all publicly registered companies have to disclose anything that's material to their business, whether it be positive or negative. So the first thing is really a realistic assessment of how important are climate and environmental and other issues. And when I'm with those, I say climate and environmental, but really there's a lot of other issues we've discussed that go into that too. There are companies that may have other concerns. So they first need to see how they're impacted. Secondly, hopefully that exercise can be done and a realistic picture taken, at least for people to start from. And then secondly, I think the companies have to look at what are their resources. Because one of the things that jumped out at us when we went through these rules, and I saw in going through them, is some companies may not even have a full suite of personnel that would be able to produce the data necessary to reach the conclusions and produce the disclosure that's in these rules. So, step one, figure out the impact. Step two, well, if we have to comply with these rules and we have to assess what's material to us, do we have the resources and the personnel and the guidance? And of course, you can bring in outside experts, you can plug gaps here and there, you realize you may need more time, but the first thing is knowing what resources are available and not available. And then I think the third thing is, really determining how proactive, as a philosophical or a policy matter, there are many companies that may see this as an opportunity as opposed to just a risk of doing something wrong, where they may say, look, we can distinguish ourselves from competition, we can be best in class, we can actually benefit from some of the rigor of looking through our the material risks and rewards associated with these issues. So I think those three things are the most important to take care of first, and not to just sort of take a wait and see attitude, because I think it'll be very difficult for companies that decide to just catch up.
Absolutely, and I fully agree with that. And to your last point, I think companies have, and we'll talk a bit about this later, but there's really an opportunity for companies to consider how far they want to go and where they want to be overall, or on an issue by issue basis, whether it's climate or any other ESG issues, frankly, whether they just want to comply with the rules, the existing rules or upcoming rules, whether they want to focus on risk and cost reduction, whether they want to focus on protecting their reputation, or then really stepping it up and take a leadership role and be strategic about the particular issues. So that's really helpful advice. Um, so a lot of companies are already complying with some of the framework standards. What if a company already includes disclosures compliant with, for example, TSFD or SASB or another existing framework? Does the rule change how companies should be approaching those disclosures? How does it work together?
So the good news is that to the extent that a company has been complying with existing regimes, I don't think that this is really a huge change. I think that they would have to go through and sort of do more of a checklist approach to say, look, this is what we do, this is what we may need to do, and those companies will be out ahead. Because in terms of general approach, the SEC said, and I think this is largely true. And I should add that I'm a U.S. qualified lawyer, and except for sort of the same reading that others could do, I don't have any particular detailed expert knowledge of the European and other regulatory regimes. But those regimes have, as noted earlier, they've kind of gotten out ahead. So any company that's already been out there for European or other purposes has been out there, assessing and dealing with these issues. I think hopefully for many of them, as a practical matter and as a compliance matter, they may have already gone through and hopefully have gone through some of those assessments we were just mentioning. So they kind of already, they're aware of the issues, they're aware of the carbon impacts, and it may be easier for those companies to address these points. So that's certainly the good news. But a company that had so far been not really required to do too much on this, either because perhaps their international operations didn't rise to that level of materiality, or for other reasons, I think they will have a harder time. So the good news is that folks who have been out there dealing with other compliance regimes in the area, I think that they already will have a significant leg forward on this.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to note perhaps that the SEC has based its rule largely on the TSFD. Now, that doesn't mean that if a company is disclosing or is disclosing under TSFD, that it is complying with the proposed rule. So they still will need to take inventory. Companies should take inventory of what they are currently disclosing and see how they comply with the rule, and then address any gaps. But definitely, companies that are disclosing under those regimes are ahead of the curve, I think. So now let's move over or let's discuss risks. So it occurs to me that there are a few different types of risks that emerge when it comes to the proposed climate disclosure rule. First, there is the climate risk itself and the impact it can have on the company. You discussed this already. So the actual numbers. Then there's also risk associated with compliance with the rule. And third, there are reporting risks. So in other words, the risk that comes from lawsuits that can arise from company disclosure. Can you talk a little bit about these various types of risks and how management can play a role in reducing them?
Sure. So I guess taking these in turn, I think actually the first one is hopefully the way that most of the other risks can be addressed. And that the first one being, really executive leadership and operations folks knowing what the real impacts are and what the real push points are for a particular business or for a particular business line of a larger multinational. So if management has a good handle on the near, medium, and long term impacts of various things, everything from fuel issues, waste disposal, labor points, issues of diversity and inclusion. If they really have an idea, and other related points, if they really have an idea of where they might be impacted, that's the first thing. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about a realistic assessment of putting aside these rules, how are changes, political, environmental, and other that are related to climate and other ESG points, how are they going to impact a company, and how is the company planning? So if they do have a plan, and that's one of the things that a lot of commentators and even the SEC, the proposed rules talk about, is one key is to sort of have a coherent plan, have something thought through. And that goes to the other points where if leadership has had a really good thought process in the sense that there's a record that they thought things through, that they tried to get the right expertise together, and that they really made a good faith effort to try to find all of the issues that would impact them materially. Well, that hopefully will lead to protections in the other risks, and I'll talk about very briefly about what to do and then what happens if you do it wrong. So once you know what the risks are and what the issues are, hopefully disclosing them is not going to be, has to be done thoroughly and carefully, but it is a matter of more of just pure compliance as opposed to hopefully it shouldn't be. I'm not going to say it's not difficult, but it's a process of disclosing what you know. So if a company has done the process right, they've really detected and discussed and planned for these issues as best as they can, well, then hopefully their disclosures won't expose them to too much risk, either on the regulatory enforcement side or on the shareholder, investor, lender side. The risk, though, of course, is there's a couple of them. One is that to the extent that disclosures are materially deficient, it's the same standard as before. You could have both equity investor shareholder suits where folks come in and they say, because the compliance with ESG was either inadequate or incomplete or otherwise had some failed in some respect, that shareholder value was damaged. And then, of course, to the extent that there are individual securities offerings here and there of debt or equity or other instruments, that the disclosure in those, that documentation, the offering documents there, investors could come in and say, look, you didn't tell me something that you should have told me, or something you told me wasn't true, which is the oversimplification of the 10b-5 materiality standard. So there's also, those are the risks, but there's also, I think it's important to say that the companies that do this well or are capable of disclosing things in a coherent fashion and can show that they do have a plan, particularly in industries that it's self-evident they're going to be impacted by or have to deal with ESG issues, those companies, I think, will be rewarded by the market too. So there's a downside of the purpose of the disclosures to let people make a clear decision. So if your disclosure has problems, then of course an issuer will have problems and management will have problems. But conversely, if an issuer does this well, I think there will be an emerging, kind of best in class in various industries where companies that have shown they're on top of this will likely be rewarded by the market. That at least is the the hopeful view.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that maybe right now companies still tend to focus mostly on risk when it comes to ESG and ESG disclosure. For example, many companies still use the traditional materiality assessment to assess which issues to report on. And that, of course, can be a helpful starting point. But as mentioned, it typically focuses on risks rather than opportunities, and it focuses on the importance to stakeholders rather than the company's impact on the environment and society. So I think you sort of mentioned it, but in addition to risks, how can companies really go about capitalizing on those opportunities? Is that simply by just looking ahead, or do you have other practical advice?
Yeah, so I think it's going to be very specific to each company, each industry, but management typically will ideally have an idea of what the baseline or what they think their competition is doing in this area or what they would suspect
Hmm.
is because obviously we're dealing here with proposed rules, so we don't have a lot of examples yet, or in some cases any examples of sort of how these disclosures will be handled, because they're the first annual reporting season and quarterly and deals done after the rules, that none of that has happened yet. But hopefully management has an idea of what they think the emerging best practices in their industry will be, and I think that the goal their goal should be to try to at least meet what they think the minimum is and do more. And I hate to advocate for the minimum, but to be realistic, some companies looking at this will probably say it's going to take a long time. Why would we be out there saying anything beyond what we have to say? So at absolute worst, they need to not be. I don't want to use a negative as a goal, but it's like
Hmm.
don't be in the bottom half of your whatever your industry or whatever your peers are. Don't find yourself in the bottom half. It's sort of
Yeah.
like being graded on the curve, and you don't want to be in the bottom half of the curve because you kind of get pulled toward the bottom. So I think that kind of riding that fine line between, many companies probably don't want to go too far ahead, but also making sure that they're not silent on anything that's really critical. And in terms of being proactive, I think it's important that companies be very open in their disclosure about how additional there's a separate risk which you mentioned, Merrill, about just the regulatory risk,
Yes.
where and we're looking at that right now. I mean, the discussion we're having right now is indicative, where I couldn't, if a client said, okay, will we have to do this for our first annual report in 2023, and I would say probably most likely not. And then they say, well, when do we have to do it then? And I would say, I don't know. Nobody really knows.
Yeah.
So that in itself is a risk, but it can be managed by some of the things we talked about earlier about companies not putting their heads in the sand, and
Exactly.
and not taking as a policy position, well that was close, but now they'll be fighting over this for a couple of years, because the truth is the
Yeah.
truth is that even if they are, it could be a year or two, and of course there's political pressures and other things coming, and I mentioned that the legal challenges and other things, but this trend, I don't think, is, at this point, it's not going anywhere. So putting
Exactly.
aside people's political views or policy views, it's something that I think companies will have to deal with. So delay is not permanent deferral.
No, absolutely. And I think that it's, as you mentioned before, it's going to take a long time to prepare for this. And also, this is not the focus on climate is not necessarily only driven by the regulators, it's also driven by investors and consumers, employees. They all want companies, well, maybe not all, but there definitely is a push from different stakeholders for companies to focus on climate, whether it's, really focus on climate or and they want to hear about it, so disclosure. So I think, as you said, or what you meant is also by taking a strategic approach and integrating ESG into business strategy and planning processes, companies will be able to not just view ESG as a source of risk, but really look at it as a business opportunity and capitalize on innovation that comes from these emerging environmental and also social issues. And I think that by taking a strategic approach, companies are more likely to consider ESG as a key competitive differentiator that help engage, their different stakeholders, whether it's regulators or also investors, consumers, and employees. And lastly, what I would like to mention is also that when it comes to ESG disclosure, we put out a report on human capital management disclosure. So that's a little different from climate, obviously, but in which we say that research has shown that transparency about human capital performance is directly linked to financial performance. So there's also an opportunity there. The disclosure, whether or not it's mandated, it really can help a company gaining an edge. So yeah, I think you have very interesting points there. Now, many of your clients are in the aviation industry. So I'd like to focus a little bit on that because could you explain how and why that industry, at least to some degree, is ahead of the curve when it comes to ESG and disclosure? And is there anything that companies in other industries can learn from that?
Yes, the airline, and I do have, we have a broad aviation industry client base here. So we kind of see things both from the large legacy carriers, the larger airlines, and also the entities that lease the aircraft and actually own the planes, because it's not really a secret, but just the way that the industry works is there are large leasing companies, and for a variety of financial and other reasons, most of the major carriers rent all of the planes that folks fly on, and it's actually better that way because it's easier to keep them maintained, and obviously they're a very expensive critical asset. So we see that from a variety of different stakeholders. So from the airline side, they've definitely had to deal with this kind of front and center for a longer period of time than many other industries, and rightly or wrongly, particularly things like carbon emissions, fuel efficiency, noise impacts have been around for a long time. And the same way that some of these regulations, were more advanced or out ahead in Europe, even in, the noise regulations have been around for a long time there. So the aviation industry, I think, is more used to having disclosures about, number one, about existing requirements, and number two, talking about how potential changes, additional regulatory issues, or political, environmental, and economic risk areas, could impact them, because they're very sensitive, of course, also to fuel prices, putting aside the emissions point. So we've seen the level of sort of a lot of standardized disclosure around this, and it's become sort of the rule that in the offerings associated with airlines or aviation lenders and lessors, there's a lot of detail about both the actual impact and potential impact of things like the noise regulation rules, the fuel efficiency rules, the emissions rules, the carbon goals in particular. And I think the airline industry and the aviation industry has become more used to just accepting that this is another factor in that when they assess their business, they don't just look at fuel prices, they look at, perceptions around, flying. And a specific one is in the last few years, we have seen and helped issuers and other participants in the industry with disclosures of things that are sort of even more intangible but could impact their business. And one of them is, one of them is something like consumer preferences, where for a little while, and this continues, there were people saying, that there's a certain stigma sometimes associated with, in some circles, associated with flying or with things that, say, 20 years ago, no one would even question, like particularly something like private jet travel. There's a lot of flack people catch for that. And these things do come in, consumer preferences, and this is where some of the things you mentioned earlier about it's not just regulatory and disclosure driven, but it's also, what are the pressures on the industry and the perceptions. So the aviation industry, I think, certainly has had to deal with these things front and center for a bit longer. I think frankly, the transition, and to the extent that these rules come in, it would be easier for some of those aviation industry players to kind of get their minds around what's required and not sort of fight the problem because they've already been dealing with it for long enough that it's just a factor in their assessment of their business. But
Yeah.
I think it's a good model because what we've done and what most of the the leaders and the compliance folks and the legal officers, rather than sort of saying, well, we don't want to deal with this, or it really has been dealt with very clearly. And I think that it's a good model for, getting leadership, getting their hands around an issue and disclosing it clearly. And then it really has not been, it just becomes a matter of course then, and not really so much of a new and frightening area for them.
Exactly.
So that would be a little easier, I think.
Yeah, so stop fighting it, basically.
Yes.
And it's very interesting what you said about perceptions, because indeed, according to research by the Conference Board, 76% of consumers say that airlines have to do more to become sustainable, with 36% saying very significant change is needed. So that's exactly in line with what you just said. It's all about perception when it comes to consumers and what companies can do to, disclosures can definitely ease that up a little bit. So back to the disclosure rules, just to conclude, what do you think that the impact of the proposed rules will be on the broader ESG picture? And what's on the horizon for ESG reporting?
So I think that first, and maybe most importantly, both the depth and the length and breadth of the proposed rules and the seriousness that the SEC and other U.S. regulators have approached this with, it makes it clear, I think, really, that this issue is not going away. And as we spoke of earlier, there may be some delays and bumps on the road, but it's not. It's a matter of time, and not a matter of if. So that, I think, is a key takeaway, and the impact on the larger ESG environment is, I think, that some people who perhaps thought this is, or their view was, or their wishful thinking was, well, this is just sort of a fad, and at the end of the day, all investors care about is the performance of their investment, regardless of, and other things, externalities and other things are not important. I think that view is going to be harder and harder to sustain, because the larger, the drum beats are out there, or the message is out there that people do care about this. And there's a certain momentum where, both for consumers, for investors, for others, I think some of it is, it's hard to point to larger trends with some certainty, but I mean, I do know that the folks who are coming up and in the new generation of investors and in finance and consumers, they are the younger people are a lot more interested in, what is the world going to look like in 10 years?
Yep.
What is the world going to look like in 20 years? So those people, I think, are also a driver behind this, and rightfully so, because they'll have to be dealing with it. So I think that the first big trend is that this isn't going anywhere. And the second one is that I hope, and I think that some, both industry players on all sides, but particularly on the issuer side, are starting to see that there's a lot of risk here, but as we've touched on, there also is some possibility of reward. And I would use an example. The aviation industry, although put under pressure, as you noted, there's a lot of people saying, look, they have to do more. There's a lot of proactive ventures to try to develop the battery arrays that are necessary, and that's progressing a lot faster than it would otherwise, because the major carriers and the major manufacturers are out there, the OEM manufacturers are out there with partnerships to put together the technology and improve the technology and kind of really fast track it, so that with luck and skill, that there will be, in fact, major reductions in carbon emissions, and we will see large passenger aircraft that are at least mainly powered by or principally or majorly offset by sustainable, more sustainable things like, battery arrays or fuels that have been developed and processes developed that have a lower carbon footprint. So that I think is also indicative, because it's not waiting. They're actually out there trying to be more proactive, and again, trying to sort of be best in class. Because to the extent that an investor or a consumer is looking around, and they all have a choice. So if they're looking around, they're going to see that there are players who are really, taking this seriously and have a plan, and are taking the actions that would help ameliorate and reduce, damages in the ESG front. And I think that those companies and those and folks who add value in those areas are going to be sought out, and they're going to be, a lot more successful than companies who just kind of say, well, look, we can keep doing things the same way we did before, and maybe we'll be impacted, maybe we won't. But I think those people are going to eventually, sooner rather than later, see themselves disadvantaged.
Absolutely. No, I fully agree with that. And of course, we spoke a lot about, climate and environmental issues in this conversation, but it's also, we also see upcoming rules or proposed rules on cyber. Then there are the potential rules on human capital management. So it's not just one area. It's a very wide array of issues that companies should be focusing on, and where they can have opportunities and where there could be a lot of rewards. So I think that's a great point. So thank you, Andrew. This has been a fantastic conversation with a lot of insights and a lot to think about. But thank you all for listening. You can find Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed's resource guide that was mentioned today on this podcast webpage, along with other relevant resources. And finally, you can find additional podcasts, webcasts, and blogs on all things corporate governance, sustainability, and citizenship by visiting ESG News and Views at conference-board.org. Thanks again, Andrew. This was a wonderful discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would be remiss if I didn't also say that I am a co-author of this, but of course, many participated, and the leading oars were also, in terms of European regulation, my colleague Brian Silliman, and in terms of, fund and issues around shareholder activism and similar points, Sandra Poe. So those folks really, they took a tremendous role alongside the work that I did too. And we of course had support from a fantastic group of associates too.
Thank you so much.
This has been ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.